You're embarrassing yourself, Nora. Do you really think showing up tonight changes anything?" She heard those words, not spoken yet, but anticipated, the way you learn to anticipate things after 11 years with a man like Preston Webb. You develop a kind of weather sense for his cruelty. You know when the storm is coming before the first cloud appears. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter and didn't open it for a full 10 minutes. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, which felt deliberate. Tuesdays were her longest days. She tutored back-to-back until 7, came home to make dinner for her daughter, Sophie, helped with homework, and by the time she sat down, she had almost nothing left. Preston had always known her schedule better than she did. He had built his whole strategy around her exhaustion. She opened it, thick cardstock, the kind that costs what she used to make in a week, embossed gold lettering. Preston Webb and Sloane Hargrove request the pleasure of your company. A gala, not a wedding. Something worse, actually. A charity gala in his name, the Preston Webb Foundation's inaugural benefit dinner at the Aldrich Hotel. Black tie. 8 o'clock. And at the bottom, in his particular handwriting, slanted and impatient, "Thought you should see what your life could have looked like, Nora. Come if you're brave enough." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and started making Sophie's grilled cheese. To understand why that note was so precisely designed to wound her, you have to understand what Preston had already taken. They met when Nora was 26. She had just finished her master's in education policy, was full of ideas about reforming the way schools served kids who fell through cracks. Preston was 33, already running a mid-size real estate development firm, the kind of man who made rooms arrange themselves around him without seeming to try. He told her on their third date that she was the most interesting woman he had ever met. She had believed him. For a long time, she believed almost everything he said. The erosion started the way it always does in these things, gradually, then suddenly. It began with her job. Not that he told her to quit. Preston was too careful for direct commands. He just made everything harder. Dinner reservations on nights she had late meetings. Social obligations that required her presence. Subtle commentary about how much her work stressed her out. How he could support them both. How Sophie needed her mother more present. And Nora, who loved her daughter with a ferocity that could rearrange her entire sense of self, had listened. Had scaled back, had eventually stepped away from the policy role she'd spent 6 years building toward. By year 4 of their marriage, she had a blog. A small one. She wrote about education, practical things, not theoretical anymore. How to talk to a teacher when your kid was struggling. How to navigate IEP meetings when the school wasn't listening. How to advocate for a child in a system that was designed to process, not see. She wrote because she still needed to think, and thinking out loud was the only way she knew how. Preston called it her little hobby. Not unkindly, exactly. Just in that particular tone that made her feel silly for having started it. The night she found out about Sloane Hargrove, she hadn't been looking. She was searching for a receipt on his laptop. They shared an Amazon account. She needed the order number for a return. The browser history was open. She wasn't looking. She just saw. Not even a message, just a hotel reservation. A recurring hotel reservation, bi-weekly, going back 14 months, at a boutique hotel in the West Loop. 2 names on the loyalty account, his, and a woman she recognized from his company events. Sloane Hargrove, VP of Development, tall, polished, the kind of woman who laughed with her whole face and made it look effortless. She sat with that window open for a long time. Then she closed the laptop, went to Sophie's room, kissed her daughter's hair in the dark, and made herself a promise she kept her voice very quiet about, even inside her own head. Not the end. Not even close. The divorce took 7 months. Preston had better lawyers, more resources, and an absolute certainty that she would crumble. She did not crumble. She found her own attorney, a woman named Elaine who cost more than Nora had, but who also came recommended by 3 separate people who had faced men exactly like Preston Webb and walked away standing. She left with Sophie, their car, a settlement that was fair but not generous, and boxes of her books. She did not take the furniture. She did not want to spend one more night in a house where she had slowly learned to make herself smaller. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and the previous tenant's cooking. Sophie, who was 9 and catastrophically perceptive, had looked at Nora on the first night in the new place and said, "Mom, we're going to be okay." Not as a question. "We really are," Nora said. And for the first time in years, she actually meant it. The next 18 months were the hardest and also the truest of her life. She went back to work. Not policy. She'd been out too long, the landscape had shifted, and she needed income faster than a policy job could provide it. She went back to teaching, high school English, long hours and low pay, and she stayed after most nights because some of her students needed someone to stay. She understood that particular need in a way she hadn't before. She kept writing the blog. Except now it was different. Now she wrote about the in-between. About being a parent and also a person in crisis. About advocating for your child while quietly falling apart yourself. About the specific, unbeautiful experience of rebuilding something from nothing while a 9-year-old watches to see if you'll be okay. Parents found it. Then other parents. Teachers shared it in staff rooms and private Facebook groups and in emails with the subject line, "You need to read this." She hired a web designer with part of her tax refund. She reached out to a nonprofit that served parents of children with learning differences. She partnered with 2 school districts in Illinois. She applied for a grant she was almost certain she wouldn't get. She got it. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Dark Secrets Live. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more of the stories that matter. Now, back to Nora. The platform was called Steady Ground. It grew the way real things grow, slowly, without announcement, until one day it was simply there, substantial and sturdy, and she couldn't quite remember building it, only that she had never stopped. His name was Callum Reed. He sent her a message through the Steady Ground contact form on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon. Professional, concise, no flattery. He introduced himself as the founder of a nonprofit called the Lighthouse Initiative, which provided educational support and counseling resources to children in foster care and transitional housing across 12 states. He'd been following Steady Ground for almost a year. He thought there might be a way to work together. Would she be open to a call? Nora Googled him before she replied. What she found made her lean back in her chair and look at the ceiling for a moment. Callum Reed had started the Lighthouse Initiative 8 years ago with a personal donation and a borrowed office space. It now operated in 31 cities, had been recognized by 3 consecutive administrations, and had been written about in a way that suggested the writer was slightly in awe. He didn't appear in many photographs. The few that existed showed a man in his mid-40s who looked like he was tolerating the camera rather than performing for it. She could respect that. She replied, "I'd be open to a conversation." She had prepared herself for the particular energy powerful men carry. That lean-back ease, the unspoken assumption that whatever room they were in was theirs. Preston had that energy. She had stopped noticing it in him only because she had stopped noticing most of him. Callum Reed didn't have it. He was punctual. He asked questions and didn't answer them himself before she finished speaking. He had clearly read everything she'd published, not just skimmed it, because he referenced specific pieces, specific arguments she'd made. 40 minutes into the first call, he said, "You write about kids in the system the way someone writes about something they take personally." She paused. "I teach some of them. You spend enough time with a kid the system has failed and it becomes personal." A beat. "That's exactly the problem with most policy," he said. "It doesn't become personal until too late." She wasn't prepared for someone to say the thing she'd been thinking for 6 years. Within 2 months, they had a formal partnership. Steady Ground's resources would be integrated into the Lighthouse Initiative's family support model across 9 pilot cities. It was the largest thing Nora had ever been part of. She stayed up until 1 in the morning reading the contract 3 times. Not because she didn't trust it, but because she wanted to make sure it was real. She told herself the rest was strictly professional. She was not convincing herself. 3 weeks before the gala, Callan came to Chicago for a planning meeting. They were finishing up at a coffee shop near her school when he noticed the Aldrich Hotel invitation tucked in the outer pocket of her bag. She had meant to throw it away twice and hadn't. He picked it up, read it, set it down. She washed his face. Nora. He said it the way you say someone's name when you're choosing your next words carefully. I know, she said. No, he paused. I want to come with you. She looked at him, not for any reason other than that you shouldn't walk into that room alone. He kept his voice even. You've built something real. You deserve to walk into any room, including that one, with someone who actually knows what you've built. She didn't answer immediately. Some things require a moment to settle before you can respond to them honestly. Callum. I mean it, he said simply. She believed him. That was the thing about Callum Reed. Not once, in 2 months of conversation, had he said something he didn't mean. Before the gala, he took her somewhere, a community center on the south side, a Tuesday evening in late October. She thought it was a site visit for the Lighthouse Partnership. What she walked into was a gathering of 40 parents whose children had been enrolled in one of the Steady Ground pilot programs, who had driven across the city on a weeknight, some of them in work clothes, some with younger siblings on their hips, because someone had told them Nora would be there. A woman named Denise held her hands when she came through the door. My daughter has a learning disability that 3 schools missed, Denise said. Your article on IEP advocacy. I printed it and brought it to the meeting, and they finally listened. She's reading now. She's actually reading. Nora held it together through 3 more conversations. She did not hold it together through the 4th. On the drive back, she was quiet for a long time. Why did you do that? She said finally. The city moved past the window. Callan kept his eyes on the road. Because I wanted you to see yourself the way those parents see you, he said. Before you walked into a room with someone who spent years making sure you couldn't. She turned and looked at the side of his face. He glanced over, just briefly. How are you feeling? Honestly? She looked back at the window. Like I forgot who I was for a while. And I can't quite believe I'm remembering. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you never forgot. You just didn't have anyone holding up a mirror. Her heart was doing something she had no immediate plan to address. The night of the gala, Nora woke at 5:15 and lay still in the dark. She did what she had learned to do in the years since the divorce. She took stock, pressed gently on everything to see what was actually there. What she found was not nerves, not dread, something quieter and more assured than either. The feeling of a woman who has done the work, paid the cost, and arrived somewhere real. She had bought the dress 3 weeks earlier with intention. Deep burgundy, draped fabric, one shoulder, clean and uncluttered. Not a dress that asked for attention. A dress that didn't need to. She wore her grandmother's thin gold bracelet, the one she had tucked into her coat pocket the morning she left Preston's house, afraid he might notice, afraid he might say something that would make her put it back. She stood before the mirror, not performing, not calculating, simply there, fully and unhurriedly herself. Look at you, she said quietly, not to the woman she was trying to become, to the woman she already was. That was enough. That was more than enough. Callum arrived at 7. She opened the door and he stood in the hallway in a dark suit, no tie, and looked at her the way people look at something that stops them mid-thought. Nora, he said, just her name, like it meant something specific. You look extraordinary, he said. Not as flattery, as fact, stated plainly the way he said everything. She laughed, surprised by how easy it was. Don't make me cry before we even get there. He offered his arm. Ready? She took it. Let's go. The Aldrich was built to communicate importance. Soaring ceilings, soft lighting that cost more than most restaurants, floral arrangements the size of small trees. The Preston Webb Foundation's inaugural benefit had drawn 300 guests, local politicians, business press, philanthropic donors, the whole careful ecology of Chicago money. A string quartet played near the entrance. And near the center bar, champagne in hand, wearing the particular expression of a man at the peak of his own narrative, Preston Webb. He didn't see her come in. The murmur reached him before she did. It started at the entrance and moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of electricity finding a path. Turned heads. A pause in several separate conversations. Preston noticed the shift the way he noticed everything, with the confident expectation that whatever it was about him. He turned toward the entrance. He found Nora. What happened on his face in the following few seconds was something the people nearest to him would describe differently afterward, but all would describe. First, recognition. She was unmistakable, even after 2 years, even across a room. Then confusion, because the woman standing in that entrance was not the woman he had stored in his memory. He had kept a very specific version of her. Tired, contracted, softened by defeat. The version he had invited here, the one he had scrawled that note to. That version he had invited here, the one he had scrawled that note to. In her place was someone who wore that burgundy dress the way you wear something that fits not just your body but your life. Who did not glance around to confirm she was being seen. Who moved with the particular ease of a person who has stopped needing anyone's permission. She looked younger. She looked lighter. She looked in the honest and specific way that is hardest to argue with, like leaving him had been the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to her. His champagne glass lowered. Then the nearest conversations reached him. That's Callum Reed. He never comes to these things. Who is she? She runs that education platform. Steady ground. She just partnered with the Lighthouse Initiative, 12 states. She's the one who wrote that piece on IEP advocacy. It was everywhere. She is stunning. Each word arrived separately with its own specific weight. Something moved through Preston's chest that he recognized and would not have named aloud in any company. His knuckles tightened around his glass. He had sent that note to remind her of what she'd lost. He had imagined her arriving with something to prove, slightly overdressed, scanning the room for him. He had imagined watching from a comfortable distance while she understood, finally and clearly, how the distance between her life and his had grown. Instead, she had walked into his gala and made it, without once trying, without once looking in his direction. About something else entirely, and Callum Reed, a man whose reputation in this city was built on genuine work and actual results, had his hand resting at the small of her back with the easy confidence of someone who has already decided he's exactly where he's supposed to be. Preston watched. Across the room, Nora said something quiet. Callum tilted his head, laughed low, private, the laugh of two people who have their own language. Preston had used his own hands to reduce the most capable woman he had ever known, systematically, patiently, without violence, just attrition, chipping away at her income, her confidence, her sense of what she deserved. And now those same hands were wrapped around a champagne flute at his own event while he watched someone else stand in the place he could have had. He looked away. There was no version of the next 10 seconds that gave him anything back. He looked back. She wasn't looking at him. If you're enjoying this story so far, please like this video and subscribe to Dark Secrets Live. Your support helps us keep making stories like this one. Now, back to Nora. What almost nobody in that ballroom knew, except 3 people from the Illinois Attorney General's office who were present that evening in a professional capacity, was that the Preston Webb Foundation was not what it appeared. Sloan Hargrove had approached Preston with the foundation concept 18 months earlier, What she had presented as a vehicle for community investment and education was, in the structure of its giving, something considerably more useful to both of them. A portion of Preston's real estate transactions had been running through the foundation's discretionary fund, money that entered as charitable contributions and exited after a series of intermediary transfers back into development projects that benefited Preston directly. Clean on paper, studied carefully, not clean at all. The IRS had been studying it carefully for 11 months. The Attorney General's office had been coordinating with them for 7. They had chosen tonight because everyone relevant was in the same room. The string quartet was midway through a Vivaldi piece when 3 things happened in close succession. 2 men near the side entrance exchanged a nod. Sloane Hargrove, who had been holding court near the silent auction tables, went very still, and Preston's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. His attorney, whose number he recognized, calling for the 3rd time in an hour. He answered it this time. His face, which had been performing its best version of philanthropic ease all evening, went through several changes that had nothing to do with the room. He stepped back from the bar. The 2 men from the side entrance had been joined by 2 more. What happened next was efficient and not dramatic, which was somehow worse than if it had been dramatic. There was no raised voice, no physical confrontation, just 4 investigators, a quiet conversation near the coat check, and Preston Webb, the man who had built this entire evening to demonstrate the size of his life, walking out of it between 2 of them in his custom suit before the Vivaldi had finished. Sloane was escorted out separately. She had the presence of mind, or perhaps simply the habit, to keep her face arranged in its careful composure until she reached the lobby. She stopped in the lobby, and she turned, and she looked back through the glass doors of the room at the guests who were now very quietly trying to understand what they had just witnessed, at the empty dais where Preston had been scheduled to speak, at the floral centerpieces that had cost an amount she had personally approved, and then she looked at Nora. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Something passed over Sloane's face that was not quite guilt, and not quite regret, but was related to both of them. The way words are related to both of them. The way words are related to the silence they come from. She looked at Nora the way you look at someone when you finally understand what you were told about them was not the truth. Then the doors closed. The room held its breath for a moment, all 300 of them, and then released it all at once in a wave of careful murmuring. Callum stood beside Nora. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see that she was. He simply stood with her the way you stand with someone in the middle of something large, present, and unhurried, not trying to make it smaller. "Well," Nora said after a moment. "Well," he said after a moment. She looked at the empty days, at the projection screen that still read Preston Webb Foundation, investing in our future, at the champagne going flat on the bar. "He planned this whole evening," she said quietly, "to show me what I'd missed." Callum didn't say anything. He planned it and scheduled it and printed that card stock and wrote that note. She paused, and then he handed me a front row seat to the end of it. A long silence. "Nora." Callum turned to face her. He said her name the way he always said it, like it was specific, like it meant the exact thing it was supposed to mean and nothing else. She looked at him. He wasn't a man who prepared speeches. She knew that about him by now. He thought out loud, sometimes imprecisely, and didn't mind being imprecise as long as he was honest. "I had something I was going to wait to say," he started. "I was going to wait until this was all over, until it was quiet, until the timing was right." He stopped. "But I don't think there's a right time for this. I think there's just an honest time." She waited. "I love the way you write about children nobody's fighting for," he said. "I love the way you argue with me when you think I'm wrong, which is more often than I'd like to admit. I love that you went back to teaching because some of your kids needed someone to stay, and that you just stayed. I love that you're standing here right now, in this room, and your hands aren't even shaking." He paused. "I love you, Nora. I've been loving you for a while, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud until I was sure it wasn't going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. He reached into his jacket and took out a small box. Dark blue velvet. Simple. The ring inside was plain warm gold with a single stone that caught the chandelier light and held it. "I know this is the strangest possible night to do this," he said with the trace of a smile. "Callum." She laughed, and it came up from somewhere deep and real. "You're proposing at my ex-husband's disgraced foundation gala. I'm aware of the optics. They're terrible." "I know. Ask me anyway," she said. He looked at her. Steady certain, nothing to prove. "Nora, will you marry me?" She had been careful with herself for 2 years. Careful about what she let in, what she hoped for, what she allowed herself to believe. She had kept her heart like a thing she was still repairing. Functional. Getting there. Not quite ready to hand to anyone. She looked at Callum Reed, who had never once treated her as anything other than the whole person she already was, and she handed it to him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." The room, 300 people who had come to this evening expecting a different kind of spectacle, erupted. Sophie heard the story 2 hours later, at home, sitting on the kitchen counter while Nora made them both tea. Nora told it plainly, without performance, the way she'd learned to tell Sophie the true things. Sophie listened. She was 11 now, catastrophically perceptive, as she had always been. When Nora finished, Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, "So he invited you to watch him be great, and instead you watched him get arrested." "Escorted out," Nora said. "By investigators." "Same thing, more or less." Sophie picked up her mug, and Callum proposed. He did, at the gala. At the gala. Sophie thought about this. "Mom, yeah? That's an incredible story." Nora looked at her daughter. This person she had protected and worried over, and sometimes, in the worst of the dark years, held together by sheer stubbornness, and smiled. "It really is," she said. The investigation took 8 months. Preston was charged with tax fraud and financial misconduct. His attorneys were expensive and energetic and ultimately insufficient. He received a sentence, served a portion of it, and emerged into a city that had moved on without him, which is the particular punishment that lingers long after the legal one ends. Sloane Hargrove cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. She was fined, barred from financial management roles, and spent a period that by all accounts changed her in ways she hadn't expected. Those who encountered her afterwards said she seemed less performed, more present. Whether that was transformation or simply the stripping away of something false, only she could say. Steady ground didn't slow down for any of it. The partnership with the Lighthouse Initiative launched in 9 cities and expanded to 14 within the first year. Nora hired 2 staff members, then 4. She wrote a book, practical, clear-eyed, unglamorous in the best way, about how parents could navigate educational institutions that weren't designed with their children in mind. It was not a bestseller by any dramatic measure, but it sold steadily, quietly, to exactly the people who needed it. Teachers assigned it. Social workers recommended it. Nora received an email about it almost every week from someone she had never met, whose child was now reading or speaking or attending a school that finally knew what to do with him. She and Callum were married on a Saturday in April at a small ceremony in a garden. Sophie stood next to Nora. The guest list was 60 people, everyone who had actually been present for the unglamorous, essential years. Nora wore a simple ivory dress and her grandmother's bracelet and felt more like herself than she ever had in any of the expensive rooms Preston had taken her to. Callum cried a little during the vows. He had not expected to and didn't try to hide it. Nora held his face in her hands and let him. They moved into a house on the north side with a yard Sophie immediately took possession of and a kitchen that was already too small and that they decided almost immediately to expand. Sophie called Callum by his first name, which he preferred, and within 6 months had developed a habit of telling him about her day in the car on the way home from school, with a thoroughness that suggested she had decided he was trustworthy. He listened every time. He never rushed the ending. 2 years after the wedding, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, Nora came downstairs early and found Callum already at the kitchen table with coffee, reading something on his laptop. She stood in the doorway. He didn't see her for a moment. She watched him. He was wearing the old gray shirt he wore on weekends and reading with the focused, slightly furrowed expression he got when something was interesting him. He reached for his coffee without looking away from the screen. Something settled in her, fully, finally, the way things settle when they are in the right place. "Hey," she said. He looked up, smiled. Just a real smile, nothing performed. The kind that arrives before you've had time to construct it. "Hey," he said back. Like it was enough, like it was everything. She went and poured herself coffee and sat down across from him. And they were quiet together for a while. The good kind of quiet that two people build slowly, without trying, over mornings and evenings and small ordinary moments that don't announce themselves as the things that matter. They matter, she knew that now. She had learned it the hard way over 2 suitcases and a borrowed faith in herself, and every night she had refused to stop. She had learned that the life you survive is not the life you were promised. It's better. It asks more of you, and it gives you more of yourself in return. On the harder mornings, because there were still harder mornings, there always would be. She thought about the woman who had sat with a hotel reservation on a screen and made herself a very quiet promise. Not the end, not even close. She found that woman with tenderness and gratitude and something that had taken a long time to grow into love. You were always going to make it, she thought. I just wish I'd known sooner. Callum reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not because she'd said anything, just because she was there. She turned her hand over and held his. And the morning came in through the kitchen window, ordinary and unhurried, and it was exactly enough.